Welcome everyone to the third live session in the World Vision Art from Latin America and the Decolonial Turn. This session is called Margins and Institutions, New Curatorial Strategies. Before introducing our chair today, I would like to just briefly go over the proceedings. So we will have a keynote address, and then our presenters, whose papers you can find in the website. So the presenters will briefly, for those who were unable to watch their papers on the website, we will briefly go over them. I have asked the presenters to summarize in 3 minutes their papers so that they can kind of better join in the discussion. And then we will open to discussions amongst the panelists and the keynote, and followed by any questions and comments from the audience. So welcome very much. My name is Michael Asbury. I'm co-organizer in this conference and Deputy Director of the Research Center for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation. So it is with great pleasure that I have to introduce our chair today, which is my colleague and friend, Paul Goodwin, who is a professor of art and urbanism at UAL, where he is also the director of the Research Center for Transnational Arts, Identity and Nation. Paul is co-lead investigator of the new transatlantic platform, an international research project entitled Worlding Public Cultures, the Arts and Social Innovation, as well as a co-founder of the Transnational and Transcultural Arts and Culture Exchange Network, TRACE. You can find a more extensive bio of Paul in the website. So without further ado, let me introduce Paul, who will welcome you all and introduce our keynote speaker today. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you for inviting me to chair this really distinguished panel with some fantastic speakers. And congratulations, Michael, to you and to Sophia for bringing together what I think is a really vital conference at this particular time. And it's the issues that you're exploring in this conference are very much issues that I've been working on with the network that you've just described, the Worlding Public Cultures Network, and around questions of decolonization, and in this particular panel to talk about curatorial questions and strategies, which is really vital. Without further ado, what I'm going to do is quickly introduce each of our speakers in order, and then finally introduce Pablo, our keynote speaker. Pablo will then speak for 20 to 30 minutes, followed by each of our panelists who will give a 3-minute summary of their paper, which you can find in totality on the website for your own reference. And then we'll have some Q&A with the audience, and you will be able to submit your questions at any point during the in the Q&A function, and I'll be able to kind of draw on that to start the discussion. So our speakers today, I'm very happy to introduce Carolina Castro Jger, who's an independent curator and researcher. She's currently a professor in the MA program in Creation Studies of the Image at the Finisterre University. And her paper, which is, as I mentioned, is available on the website, is called Hegemonies Up to the South of the South, Decolonizing the Museum for Mapuche Spirituality and Wisdom. Then we'll be followed by Pamela Desjardins, So that's probably the French translation of that. I'm sorry, Pamela, if I've mangled your name. Please do correct me when you do your paper. Pamela is a contemporary art curator researcher based in Mexico City. She's currently a PhD candidate in art history at UNAM, National Autonomous University of Mexico, and her paper is called The Critical Imagination, the First Contemporary Art Museums in 3 cities in Latin America, the cases of Limac in Lima, La N in Buenos Aires, and Numu, Guatemala City. Clara Masnata has a PhD from Harvard and Humboldt University of Berlin. She's an independent curator and scholar based in Berlin and Buenos Aires. Her paper is called Narratives and Facts from Argentina, the Buenos Aires Instances of the Museum Global Initiatives from Germany's Kulturstiftung 2017 and the Art of Basel Cities from 2018. Clara is followed by Eloise Rodriguez, who is a final year PhD candidate at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester here in the UK, and was also a research associate at the Santo Domingo Center of Excellence for Latin American Research at the British Museum. Her paper today is which we'll be summarizing, is called Reflecting on Museums Acquisitions from a Decolonial Perspective, the Case of Brazilian Art in Public Collections in the UK. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of those summaries shortly. But let me now quickly introduce our keynote speaker, who is Paulo Miada. Excuse me, Paulo. Paulo is a curator and contemporary art researcher, and he's currently, of course, adjunct curator of the 34th Sao Paulo Biennale, which is called Through the Dark, Still I Sing, from 2019-2021, and an adjunct curator of the Centre Pompidou in Paris. From 2015, he is the chief curator at the Institute Tomi Otake, having joined the Institute's team in 2010 as research and curatorial nucleus coordinator. I love that term, curatorial nucleus. I'd love to hear what that entails, Paulo. So Paulo will speak, as I said, for 20 to 30 minutes, and his paper is called Poetics of Relation in the 34th Biennale de Sao Paulo. Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for having this debate, for organizing the whole program, and for my colleagues that will introduce shortly after for their presence and research. I will shift to Portuguese as I start my presentation. As we agreed, it would make sense in this context. So if anyone requires, you can go to the bottom right of your Zoom screen and shift it and hear the interpreter in Spanish or English. Bom, eu escolhi esse título.
I chose this title, Should We Even Try? That's the topic of my presentation today. This is the first time I speak publicly about the Biennale. Ever since Jger Isbell left us. He was a Mapuche artist, an indigenous people's artist in Brazil. He was born in the Raposa Serra do Sol reservation, which is at the core of the debate of indigenous rights to land, to life in Brazil. He is an important figure at this Biennale, and I'll be referring to some of these aspects during my presentation. His sudden death has left us all in mourning. We're all in mourning. The Brazilian and Latin American culture, and in other places as well. He was a very active and challenging voice and he would face head-on this counter-colonizing action. He wanted to establish that dialogue whilst confronting these different epistemologies, these knowledges, these different cultures, so that encounter is always accompanied by colonizing violence. However, he would propose alternatives so that we do not take into account the lack of translation or communication hurdles or inferences. So that should be the starting point to establish that artistic conversation. So his art would provide bridges and possibilities so that other aspects of life would find roadblocks, so to speak. So he was an activist. His art was militant, was collective. He would call it contemporary indigenous art. Of course, we pay tribute publicly. I'm talking about his death also because we are very moved. That's why I chose to present to you a few aspects of the 34th Bienal. So, looking at these elements from his point of view, from what Jger Isbell proposed as an art form. This is a very large project indeed. It started out between 2018, 2019, but we ended up extending it for another year due to the pandemic. And that is the result of a collective work for at least these people: Jacopo Crivelli Visconti, the chief curator; Carlos Zaccanini, guest curator; Francesco Stocchi, Ruth Steves, and Ana Roman, assistant curator. This is more of an existential and emotional point of view. And I am at that point, and I'm at that place, actually. I'll be speaking from my personal perspective. At the same time, I take full responsibility for that point of view that I'm taking today. However, taking that responsibility does not mean that I'm talking about things that I proposed, that I brought to the Bienal. Of course, this is the result of a collective work, opinions, suggestions from all these people: artists, producers, collaborators, editors, designers, architects, and so on and so forth. So this Bienal did not start from a specific topic or a theme. This is the title, to recognize where artists are coming from, but we want to point out that that experience is relevant to, and it's important to discuss artistic creation. But we did not start out with the theme. The team decided to bring about propositions or suggestions about works of art or artists that should be seen today. It's a complex curatorial challenge, because with the lack of theme, we would be tempted to come up with a preconceived notion. But these Marty, Edouard Glissant, would be a shared point of reference. And even because of that fact, per se, this is not seen or translated as a theme, but the challenge, actually, of not having that common sense, we should be wondering, should asking ourselves what could be shown. And we ended up starting to realize or noticing some similar characteristics of different artists that are of different age groups, different areas, styles. So we decided to put together this Biennale based on these similar characteristics shared by these artists. But before we came up with the names of the groups, this was an open space. The audience would see a closed category. So we decided to group them by objects, images that are very diverse. They all go beyond visual arts and contemporary art. Many of them have some relations with artists and authors, but they overlap, they go beyond those boundaries. Each work of art carries their own story, and we provide that with these objects. And our proposal is that these stories should be reviewed, revised by each attendee, each member of the public, and then the works of art would instill them to thinking about that. This will be an exhibit by December 5th. This is a collection of the National Museum of Rio de Janeiro. As many of you must know, had a catastrophic fire at the end of 2018, right before the opening of the previous Biennale. That's a fire that leaves us with an incurable scar, and it hurts science, culture, education in Brazil and in Latin America, and to a certain extent, a global loss and a very regrettable loss to the world, an unprecedented loss. So these are three objects that are part of that collection today. They're all marked by that or scarred by that fire. That's the Santa Luzia meteorite, the second largest. It's a cosmic object. It's traveled through large distances across the atmosphere. So that survived the fire. It wasn't necessarily affected by the heat of the fire. It remained as it was, has been tempered by high temperatures. The second object is this quartz. It used to be a violet amethyst, and being subject to over 400 degrees Celsius for over 4 hours, it has become a citrine, an orange. This is the result of that major accident, that nightmare. It's no longer the same. The third object, the most important one in my opinion, is this Kajar doll. The entire collection was lost in that fire. These are very fragile objects. However, this doll, Kaimote Kamayora, they got in touch with the researcher that worked with their people on the following day after the fire. And he heard that the artist said, I'm already making a new doll to reconstruct that collection. I think it's important to point out that something was lost. Of course, the objectives, or the objects rather, were lost. However, the material existence of the objects is secondary to the existence of the culture, the life of the people that makes that doll possible. Not only the object per se, but a reconnection between their people, their culture, that sets the first step towards a reconstruction. So these are three objects that go through that trauma and they survive. They come out with several different resources. Actually, that difference was very important to us because we didn't want to point out or to indicate just one way to overcome these traumas, these violent acts, but think about these objects with the artists to think about many different ways in which you can find resilience and start to rebuild. So we wanted to have works of art that would work on resistance, repetition, resilience, based on contemporary art, drawing, the confrontation of materials, just like this collection of over 100 monotypes. And right next to a production like Adawida, she's an artist that uses resources of assembly or the production or the costumes of drag queens, not considering consumption, beauty, luxury. Of course, this is a deconstructed work of art, but she takes a step further and she brings in these repertoire of accessories and costumes and textiles to bring that image that indicates ancient wisdom, the knowledge of the Amazon forest, these different knowledges that are incorporated in the construction, that persona that Awira, she performs in the city of Manaus on a daily basis, attracting a lot of attention with that monstrous presence of Awira, alongside other artists that you may have heard of, Jen Jones. I'll have to be brief in some transitions, but we can go back to them if you're interested. This is when we could open the pavilion back in November last year. So we were during the lockdown. But again, these are the portraits of Frederick Douglass, the most photographed person in the 19th century, an abolitionist, as you may know, a great speaker. And he learned how important it was to circulate images, to scatter them, to provide that counter narrative that would challenge stereotypes imposed by African descendants in the United States, that would challenge the huge amount of segregation, prejudice on descendants of enslaved peoples. And he had hundreds of pictures in which he would pose, and he would encourage that image to be circulated extensively. This is opening a series of works of art that discusses the circulation of images, bodies, existences, cultures, goods, natural goods in the contemporary context and in the historical context as well. This is an important section of this Bienal. Paulo Capello, an Angolan artist, is present there too. And let me just point out that this Tony Coates is there too. In the Frederick Douglass circulation of images is also present in this work of Tony Coates. He discusses a case in which the strength of the political engagement in the struggle, in the fight for the rights of the Black population in the United States, that was driven from something that was no images, a huge resistance example. And due to the lack of images, the imagination of people started to work, and they brought in their political beliefs that was even more powerful, even when compared to situations, similar situations that did have an image. So this is how important it is. An historic event was even more efficient than an image would. And later on, towards the end of that level, Jger as Bill, this is Letter to the World. That's an intervention, actually. Gallery Delta, an encyclopedia of Arte Universal. This is about general knowledge from the West, a colonizing approach that summarizes the history of art, just mentioning prehistoric art. There's a passage, a little bit of Greece and Roman Egypt, etc. And all of a sudden, Europe, and it stays there. Universal art is just concentrated in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, and so on and so forth. So here's what Jger did. He intervened on every page, almost all of them, as if he were adding some footnotes, so to speak. We could call it a détournement, an appropriation. He makes comments, he draws on top of each image. He goes back and forth, the juxtaposition of symbols and signs, the playful and ironic interaction between images and interventions, or in that case, an acid criticism, denouncing those assumptions that Western art is universal, and at times focusing on the urgent situation that indigenous peoples are faced with in Brazil and an imminent or environmental collapse, unfortunately. In that case of Jger, that can be seen in other 3 sets of works as well, it seemed to me that it was important when talking to him. Okay, let me describe what that dialogue was. Our proposal was to have himself alongside other 9 artists that are identified with indigenous people, not only in Brazil, but Latin America and in other areas of the world as well. They could all be present at this Bienal to establish that conversation, and being faced with works of art of other artists from other parts of the world. We didn't want to isolate them in silos, not making any epistemological distinctions. separating contemporary art from indigenous contemporary art. We wanted to put everyone together under the same roof, expressing themselves with their many different backgrounds. So we wanted to share that kind of dialogue with the audience. At the time, it was very difficult to combine or to bring people together. So we know that the conversation had always been, or was at the time, based on violence and hatred and friction. However, at the same time, Jger would discuss something that would go beyond these conversations as to how to introduce artists, how to show them to the audience. He wanted to legitimize contemporary indigenous art and filter it and include it within the broader concept of art production. He wanted to show voices and indigenous perspectives could be playing several roles, that of the artist, the curator, the writer, the educator role, etc. It should be collective, should be complex. It shouldn't be limited to the individual presence of each artist, Jger himself, and many, many others. There's another aspect I don't have time to discuss in depth. So this Bienal will have dialogues, conversations with over 20 institutions in the city. These are individual productions, and you end up taking that broader avenue to better understand the world of that specific artist. We came up with a suggestion with the Sao Paulo Modern Art Museum that embraced that idea with that dialogue with these three artists. So we have individual exhibits, and we would bring the other artists as a curator. That's what happened with the Maquin Surari exhibit. So that would be offering a different perspective. Several contemporary indigenous artists are part of it, part of a global production and more comprehensive production that is at the Bienal. And here, that would bring that something to concrete terms, something that's still complex, indecipherable, something that cannot be summarized into one work of art. That was the presentation of an entire collection of indigenous art. So let me focus in this last point. I'm running out of time. That dynamics of discussing works of art, artists, and how relations take place, this is something that is seen in the poetics of relations. This is a subject in itself in this section. That is the dedication from Constantine Brancusi in his New York exhibit in 1926. That was to Tarsila do Amaral and Oswald do Andrade. They got married and they left Paris, not saying goodbye, but nonetheless, he would be sending that catalog as a tribute to that marriage. Many of you may know that's a reference couple, it's a model couple for anthropophagy in Brazilian modern art. So there isn't a lot of information about the historical event. We wanted to point out that the relations between artists are way more complex than organizations and the history of art will depict. Indirectly, we wanted to point out that the week of 1922 was celebrating its 100th anniversary and the 100th anniversary of the Anthropophagic Manifesto. So we are now proposing yet another encounter. Works of art that were produced in the 80s, the 90s. Ligia Papi was directly interested in the anthropophagic generation and that manifesto. And she was critically thinking, but indirectly thinking how much that discourse of that modernistic generation pointed to something that was stealing the cosmopolitan culture, the vanguard culture that would be devoured from a local perspective, from a Southern point of view. And at the same time, making a second steal of those that would be killing the local characteristics, the Brazilian characteristics, more specifically, the knowledges of indigenous people and African descendants and their culture as well, both present in our country. So that was a generation of white artists, white Latin artists. They would be appropriating that cosmopolitan knowledge that was Eurocentric, and they would be appropriating what they associated to some local knowledge, making that reference from that notion of absence, from that procedure of absence. They would be repeating something that was not directly connected to what they were coming from. And through books, research, references, they would reclaim or would appropriate to themselves to build that hybrid discourse.
Now, Ligia Papi relates with that, but instead of seeing this as a natural process, she creates different works, such as this one, in which the absence is seen as presence, rather. She'll speak about the contradiction and the conflicts between local identities and how contradictory it is to look at these local presences and not consider indigenous voices. How controversial it is not to consider indigenous voices under the national context. So there is some melancholy in these works. This set of works has been put close to Nayara Tucano's works. She kind of responds to this historical narrative, saying that here is my presence, my people, my presence is here. This is no nostalgia. We're not being appropriated by the others. We're portraying ourselves as something that is alive. We're not part of a distant past. And we want to be part of this debate. We want to build this future together. Moving on to the final examples. These are some works that I have been reflecting a lot upon. After Jger left us, after these works were exhibited. Ethics and aesthetics are not about being enough. I believe there are many Brazilian people watching us, and they know that thinking that something will be enough is quite a naive idea, not only in terms of art, but in terms of our social, environmental, and economic aspects. No single action or initiative will be enough. However, I believe this debate is still important. In ethics and aesthetics, the question if they are enough or not becomes secondary. It's not about judging things and trying to assess whether or not they will solve things. It's about what is necessary. We do things in ethics and aesthetics not because we want to solve it all, but because we believe this is something that needs to be done at this point. And I believe the artists I mentioned are all on the same page. They stem from the same origin. This is no easy feat, but it's up to us. It's up to institutions. And this is the important role this panel plays to acknowledge and validate these actions that are done because of this need. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over my time.
Thank you so much, Paulo. Thank you very much for that. And by the way, you didn't go over your time. You were absolutely on time, about 30 minutes or so. So thank you so much for that. That paper was full of so many issues and questions. Just to remind the audience to please put your questions for Paulo and also the other speakers into the Q&A function, please. So we'll go straight now to our first speaker who will be summarizing her paper, which is Carolina. Carolina, thank you.
Yes, Paul, thank you. Thank you very much. And Paulo, thank you for your presentation. I'll turn into Spanish. Quiero dar las gracias por esta invitación.
I'd like to thank you for this invitation to be here and for the opportunity to be able to present my current research in this context. I feel extremely close to what Paulo was saying. I would like to thank my colleagues from the Mapuche Nation who made it possible to carry out this research and who have contributed with their testimonies and with their own research. As many of you know, Chile has begun writing a new constitution, and it includes finally the voices of some of the original voices of this territory, a constitution for a plurinational state, or quiñe, like they say in Mapuche, with 1,800,000 people who recognize themselves as Mapuche. This nation represents 10% of the population of our country. And as Elisa Loncon, a Mapuche woman who today heads the Constituent Assembly, points out, and I'd like to quote her, she says that since the conquest, the Mapuche people have never renounced their rights. The struggle for land, territory, identity, and language, constant demands that seek to end racism, the denial of identity, and the plundering of their territory over hundreds of years. So the paper that I presented here, and which is found on the website, the Worldviews website, the aim is to show the strategies that are coming from the Mapuche spirituality as a strategy of decolonization of the museum space. And so it has to do with 3 case studies. The first is the performative work of art of Paula Baeza Pailamilla, and it tries to show the invisibility of the Mapuche people and the whitening of the Chilean state. And then of the MAS, the Archaeological Museum of Santiago, and they have worked with Francisco Huichaqueo, and they work with Portal of Light. It's an exhibition that was done through the practice of dream, creating a dialogue between the Mapuche world and the people of Chile. And finally, we have a constitutional critique that comes up from the communal thought. So in some, these three cases talk about how urgent it is to consider ancestral traditions that are still alive today. In this case, the Mapuche tradition itself, like many other indigenous traditions in the Americas, in order to learn from them and to show the irreducible distance that exists in the way objects are seen and integrated into the world, their agency, and their power as well. And now I will give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Carolina. Just to say that was exactly 3 minutes. And I am timing it, by the way, guys. So thank you very much for that, Carolina. So the next speaker, please, Pamela, would be great. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Voy a hablar en castellano.
Thank you so much. I will also be speaking in Spanish. And thank you so much, like Carolina said, for the opportunity to be here presenting my research. This research has been ongoing for a few years now. I mentioned this also in the recording. This is a research that began as a research focused on a curatorial process, and now it became more academic. And it has to do with the uncertainty of rethinking or thinking how museums were founded in the Latin American context. So the presentation that I did focuses on 3 cases, which are the main cases that I'm studying as part of my doctoral research in the Autonomous University of Mexico. And these are the first museums that appear as contemporary art museums in 3 Latin American cities. And the particularity of these cases is that they do not respond to the standardized canon of international art, contemporary art museums. So from an ironic standpoint, they're criticizing, first of all, the absence of a contemporary art museum within their context, but also it's a critique towards the standardized model of art museums or contemporary art museums. And these cases are LIMAC in Lima, La N in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and El Numu in Guatemala City. And these are cases that are, I mean, they say that they are contemporary art museums, but they don't really respond to this parameter or standardized model of contemporary art museums because they work more as self-managed spaces. And this has been a very important way to generate institutionality in the Latin American context. And it's also a very important part of the research to rethink how artists have had a main role in the imagination and in the foundation of institutions in the Latin American context. And these are the cases of the spaces that I just mentioned now that are self-managed. And these cases are talking about this double critique about the institutional emptiness and the deficiencies in the cultural infrastructure, and also to rethink how can we reimagine new models and other ways of thinking museums, because I think that that's also the intention of the research for the future, to think about these museum models that are working in a more local context and at a lower scale, and also thinking about the future in terms of like energy, for example. So we need something that's more local, and it has to be more related to the local context, and also keeping in the affectionate aspect as well. That's all. Thank you.
Perfect, Pamela. Great. Thank you. Next, I believe it's Clara.
Yes. Hello. Well, my paper, I will speak in English. My paper is entitled Narrative and Facts from Argentina, the Buenos Aires instances of the Museum Global Initiative for Germany's Kulturstiftung from 2017 and of Art Basel Cities from 2018. And it analyzes the Porteño, the two Buenos Aires chapters of these two global art initiatives. First, the Museum Global program from Germany, from Germany's Federal Cultural Foundation, resulted in a collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art, or Museo de Arte Moderno de Buenos Aires. Second, the Art Basel Cities was the first and the only instance in which this global giant of art fair produced an event without an art fair in the city of Buenos Aires, and which was chiefly funded by the local government. I will turn to the first case. Funded by the Kulturstiftung, the Museum Global is a German federal program that seeks to open up the perspectives on the collections of several museums nationwide. And I quote, Global Museum stands for the critical examination of the collections of several museums in Germany and, by extension, the Western-centric canon of art. An ambitious aim. So one of the 5 chosen participating museums, the Museum in Frankfurt of Modern Art, the MMK, chose as partner the Museo de Arte Moderno de Buenos Aires, the MAMBA, or the Moderno, and together they co-curated the shared travel and exhibition, A Tale of Two Worlds, which was publicized as, I quote, the first time that a European museum has allowed its collection to be examined by Latin American curators, thus, I quote, breaking new ground for Latin American art. This new groundbreaking was basically reconfiguring the collections of several collections in one exhibition space. So to this, I contest and ask to what extent was really this resultant display effectively against setting the Latin American production as an additional chapter of art history writ large and from the center. And was there really no hierarchy of artistic movements, as the curatorial statement read? So I contest this advertised narrative by highlighting the Mambas, the Museo Modernos, missed opportunity to complete a local project, which was scheduled to be a co-production, high fall again, in Paris with the Jeu de Paume, which was to bring unforeseen images to visibility, to unearth them out of the archive, and thus really change history, visual and non-visual, in lieu of rearranging something given into a new display. So the project was cancelled in favor of the direction's own project and also in favor of the Art Basel Cities. A second point to bolster and contest my critique was the rhetoric of brotherly equals global players that this exhibition put forth amidst the rise of the feminist movement in Argentina and Latin America in 2018, mainly for the women's fight for abortion. And then my paper then ends with a consideration of Art Basel Cities and how with the economic crash of the Argentinian economy and peso in 2018, the discourse, as well as these two initiatives, were reduced and the discourse changed from this triumphalist, globalist spirit of equal brothers onto a focus on what is local and on what is national in art that nevertheless was very problematic. So I invite you to look at the thoroughly documented video online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. Beautifully presented. A little bit over time, but beautifully presented. Thank you so much. We'll continue this in the discussion. Eloisa, can we have your presentation?
Yes, thank you all. It's really great to be part in this conference and in this panel. So my presentation focused on analyzing this data I collected through the survey of Brazilian art in the UK that is part of my PhD research. This analysis draws from Walter Mignolo's critique of the museum as a colonial institution. So for this survey, I contacted over 500 public collections in the UK, asking if they held artworks from Brazil, which resulted in a database with almost 1,500 objects. I analyzed this data both quantitative and qualitatively, showing some patterns of collecting activities, such as the institutions with the highest number of Brazilian objects, where they are located, and who are the most collected artists. Then I focused on the case of Escala, which is the Essex collection of art from Latin America. Escala was created in 1993 within the context of the teaching of art history at the University of Essex. When analyzing Escala's holdings of Brazilian art, I observed the importance of networks that facilitated donations of artworks, because from the beginning, Escala built their collection through donations, although they don't operate in this way anymore. And these networks, they acted in different levels, like globally and locally. So I think the main points to take from my presentation is that using data from a survey like this helped me to deconstruct museums' collecting practices and consequently their structures of power. So, of course, the data alone is not enough for deconstructing these structures, and it is essential as well to consider broader contexts of acquisitions to identify hidden motivations and hidden networks. But in this process of a more in-depth investigation, one needs to access particular documentation and people that some museums do not particularly want to facilitate access to. So yeah, in this process of deconstructing museums' structures to analyze collecting practices of Brazilian art in the UK, it became obvious to me that museums need to be more transparent, for instance, in their decision-making processes. And paying attention to these networks also remind us that these organizations, museums, and they are made of people that, and having this in mind sheds light on the knowledge that museums have and the knowledge that museums, that is absent in museums. And the last point is that deconstructing these structures allows for as well revisions of museums' collecting practices, which can result in expanded networks and consequently a revision of the knowledge museums produce through the objects they collect. And that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adawida. Aloisa, sorry. Excuse my pronunciations of mangling, misrepresenting all the names today. We have a think. Thank all of you for your presentations, and also, of course, for Paulo for his really rich keynote. I think we've got about half an hour. As always, I've worked with Michael over quite a few years. Michael has very helpfully given us some wonderful questions to ask, which I will draw on at some point, but I also have my own questions. Michael, by the way, is one of the best people that I know to ask. He asks some of the best questions you can get at a conference. He always comes up with really great questions. So I'll feed some of those in a minute. But let me just start by turning to responding to, and I'll speak a little bit slowly for the interpreters, to Paulo's presentation. And just to say, Paulo, I really need to get to Sao Paulo to see that show. The selection of artists is incredible, and the artworks that you showed just kind of blow my mind. Many of the artists I know and have or have worked with or seen some of them their work. So fantastic work, and the fact that also you're drawing on Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, which is something that I'm very interested in. I'm actually, just to do a bit of shameless advertising, next week we're organizing with Tate a big international conference on the influence of Caribbean global thought on contemporary art. And one of the key thinkers that we're focusing on is Edouard Glissant, as well as Sylvia Winter and Stuart Hall. But anyway, that's advertising over. Paolo, what I was going to ask, and this is maybe something to reflect for everyone. So this panel is around curatorial strategies, and I was quite interested in some of the points you made, right, about the nature of the specific nature and histories of some of the objects that you displayed that have, as you said, very traumatic histories that come and are the product of other knowledges that are not normally, if you like, accommodated within the space of the white cube gallery. So my question is, and this is a question perhaps to all of you, as you mean, by the way, the range of examples today is incredible. So we've got many different examples, different contexts, different museological contexts, etc. But what I wanted to ask first to Paolo, and then for anyone else to reflect on, is in terms of, as curators, what kind of curatorial strategies do we need to implement in relation to the dominance of the white cube, right? So you're talking about histories and objects that have really traumatic histories. Is the white cube, now of course, Paolo, you're working within the museum and the pavilion, which I've been to, I visited with Michael in Sao Paulo, which is obviously, it's very much a giant white cube. But I mean, are there ways as curators, in terms of the presentation of the artworks, is there ways that we can work with that kind of sense of being attentive to other knowledges, other modes of display, other forms of strategies that kind of somehow will be aware, make us aware of the dissonance, the potential dissonance between, on the one hand, the very Western museological model that you see visually in, for example, the pavilion in Sao Paulo, and the works of art themselves and their particular histories. Is that clear? Is that question clear? Thank you.
Well, I'm sure there are many ways one could address this. My perspective has been so far always in favor of complexity as part of any kind of answer, in the sense and to me this is one other reason why Glissant is a very important reference, because he's never providing pure solutions or single-minded or only one pattern to address anything. He's always went back and forth, kind of circling around, inside and backwards. And some of the artists we have been working very closely with, like Mantia Diawara in one hand, which was another artist that one could do a complete presentation on the biennial based on the influence or the convergence of the dialogues that Mantia brought to this biennial. And today I started with Jger because it's important to do so, I guess, right now, but we could do the same with Mantia. And what I feel is that in the same way that the whole agenda that what we call the colonial term, or what Jger would call counter-colonial gestures, or what Glissant might call the creation of the two monde and of this baroque of voices, depends of getting in and out established structures, in and out epistemological devices, in and out any sort of institution and system. And this is what really fascinates me in people like Jger Capella, Jger Asbel, Paulo Capella, or Mantia Diawara. They do present gestures that can go directly to a museum space, or to an art system, or to a collection, or to a white cube, if you want. But this is a point in a more complete, in a more complex and overlayered agenda and set of gestures. And I think this is important not only for curatorship and not only for the art discussions of the coloniality issues, but for politically right now. We cannot do it without changing the educational system, but it's not enough. But if you don't do it there, and the same with the museum and so on. So, and this is one of my constant concerns, how to do clear gestures inside the institutional and exhibition space, but being aware and being sure that they are connected with things that might happen on the city or on the street or on digitally or on discursive levels, and depending on who you are talking to, in other kind of levels which are not discursive at all, but ritual or collective and so on.
Thank you, Paulo. I really love that formulation of in and out. That really, makes me think quite a lot, because one of the formulations that I've been using my own curatorial work and my own thinking about working within these institutions is a formulation by Fred Moten and Stefan Mohani. They talk about the idea of being in but not of the museum, or in but not of the university or the institution. So it's that kind of how you navigate those spaces. And I love the idea of working in and out. And of course, the question that you asked about, no single action will be enough. But ethics and politics, ethics and aesthetics can't be limited to that. It's what's needed. I think is really important. Can I, does that question that I asked about modes of presentation, does that resonate with anyone else? Does anyone else want to jump in on that in terms of their own experiences?
Yes,
Clara?
I will jump in. I think the key here, which is one of the tenets of decoloniality, is historicize. Historicize. Let's go to exhibition history. When I did my exhibition, when I finally managed, after it was canceled by the global partners' interest, to stage my exhibition on Giselle Freund, I did a reconstruction of the way it was originally seen, right? So it's exhibition history in the way you see it. So you could enter a space that already has the history and the temporality of it. It's, it isn't a modern space maybe, but it evokes the way it was shown and exhibited. And here it connects. So I think historicize is key, and we should not forget that the white cube is not the only way of seeing things, nor it was, and this is something that can be quoted and reconstructed, and that's the way I did it, and I tried to do it. And I would also like to answer Michael's question on the chat about how do Western Michael, do you want to ask it live? How do Western institutions, how can we break away from this binary relationship of center and periphery? I use global north and global south in my, let's post that as equivalent, which my paper discusses in terms of the intervention of Western institutions within Argentina. Again, my exhibition was a turn of the tables, because it was an exhibition that was originated in the global south, that wanted to break the import-export dichotomy, because it was going to be co-produced in Paris with the Jeu de Paume. So already something that is from the south and is exported to the north, showing them that an artist who was born in Europe and had an exile migratory background in Argentina that history could be changed from those. So that's the way I think, like both institutionally in terms of like production, as well as to what the history has been done that it's not only the sole history that's been told, but it can be illuminated and brought out of the archive, something that we don't know, and that requires the hard work of research. And it's not just like the DJ mix match of bringing what we already know in a new configuration, but really historicize, work hard, go to the archive, do it.
Thank you, Clara. Carolina, I think your hand is raised. Did you want to come in there?
Había levantado la mano porque me pareció interesante.
Yes, I had raised my hand because I thought it was interesting how both aspects were talked about, what Paulo said and what Clara said about this idea of what Clara says, the global south or the global north or the center and periphery, like you mentioned. And also, one of the questions that Michael added into the chat, which says, if the museum converts into a medium to isolate community from life, and how the institution can relate to life without its traditional role of freezing elements or items in time. So what I was thinking, well, I was thinking about my research and about what was being discussed right now. And the Mapuche nation nowadays in Chile is discussing how a museum would be, if we think about the Mapuche world, right? How it would be from this indigenous tradition. And to me, it's very interesting because the question that they ask themselves, even why a museum if we're alive? Why do we want a museum if we're right here? You know, we can tell our stories, we can use our own items and archaeological items and objects that we use. I mean, they say we use it in our daily life, in our rituals, in, yeah, every day. So why a museum? But there's something that I think is very interesting about this, which is, I mean, not necessarily there's the idea of rejecting all types of apparatus that comes from this colonial vision, but rather how do I bring it to me and how do I use it from my point of view, from my standpoint. So the Mapuche nation is kind of going through this process where, I mean, we know that the horse was introduced in America because of the conquistadors, but the Mapuche took this new technology and transformed it with spiritual rites. It gave it different types of herbs and water, and it tried to have this affection. It wasn't like an animal, like it was seen under colonial light, but rather just an animal. And they say that that we have to do with the museum like what Lautaro did with the horse. So the process of transforming it, of giving it another point of view, another perspective, having a different gaze. So I don't know if I really have an answer to the idea of how the museum institution can relate to life without freezing items in time, but I do think that it's necessary that, I mean, in the case of there being items or objects of an indigenous culture that is still alive, we have to consider it as part of that. I mean, I think on the one hand, we have the entire discussion about the indigenous populations and giving back to them, but then what can these nations do with this? What infrastructure can they create, let's say, in order to be able to have, once again, their own patrimony? So I think that that's extremely interesting to discuss. I mean, think about how the indigenous gaze is incorporated and how the indigenous nation, in this case, the Mapuche, can it create its own institutionality, let's say it that way.
Thank you, Carolina. I think added to that is, what is the relationship of the indigenous Mapuche to the curatorial? How are they represented in the curatorial infrastructure in that country as well? Pamela, can you come next, and then Eloisa.
Sí, gracias. No, un poco también.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I also agree with what Clara, Carolina, Paulo said, and also answering to Paul's question, I think that thinking about curatorial strategies and in my own research and what I'm interested in, I think that it has to do with dismantling and remantling and reimagining, let's say, other museological devices. And I think that that's also something that we think about in art, but also when we think about critical museology or social museology, I think that there are very interesting cases like in Brazil, like how they've reformulated the museum. I mean, they have insisted on this. They continue having this idea of naming it as a museum, but it doesn't necessarily have to respond to that idea of museum that we have in our Western imaginary. So, I mean, there are cases in Brazil, and we can also think of the case of the Museo del Barro in Paraguay, which has also been a very interesting case and very important case to think precisely about how these other voices enter these spaces. A little bit about like what Carolina said, how these communities that haven't been integrated or that are thought of as something dead or from the past or ancient, like not alive, right? How can they enter and interrupt, let's say, the narratives and dismantle that museological device? I think that these are cases that we have to continue studying, looking at, and thinking about this. We have to insist on these things that have already been done, and we have to think, for example, what that museum or strategies are, curatorial strategies are, in order to reformulate everything from our context. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Pamela. And I love the idea of dismantling museological devices. That's what we need to do. We just need to dismantle museological devices. One more comment quickly from Eloisa, and then there's a couple of questions that are coming in from the audience as well. Thank you.
I actually was going to ask a question to Paulo, a different one, if that's okay, and answer two questions that it's in the chat. I'm going to switch Portuguese. Oi, Paulo, tudo bem?
Hello, Paulo.
Sorry, I need to switch off.
Here's my question. I wanted you to elaborate on the idea of inviting Jger Isbell to be part of the Biennale. Was it something that was part of your original plan? Had that been thought previously? Could you give us some context on how this decision was made? And then, how did the curatorial team take this decision when Jger Isbell went popular on social media? Can you say a few words about that?
The two questions that was in the chat, Clara had asked me about about like how much money and resources and exhibition spaces is allocated to Brazilian objects. In relation to money, this is something that most museums do not want to talk about. In the UK, they have laws that protect them from disclosing this kind of information. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. And in relation to exhibition space, from the data I collected, I calculated that just about 7% of those artworks are actually on public display. But then again, this is a number that can vary because museums displays are constantly changing. And Michael had asked me about how can my quantitative analysis be employed in critiquing the manner in which objects become narratives through collections. And he was thinking about Tate Modern's room, A View from São Paulo. That's a very interesting question, and I think that especially with this particular display at Tate that's called A View from São Paulo, but many of the artists displayed there as part of the movement from Rio, Grupo Pranchas. I know you're very much aware of it, Michael, but I think like in relation to how this data can be used, exactly that, for curators to know exactly the objects they have in the collection, which, as we know, museums are full of objects stored in the storage that many curators, especially because it is a position, these days, that are constantly changed, and they never get to know the collections they actually have in their displays. So I think this quantitative analysis can be used towards this knowledge building as well, and to identify what they have and what they don't have, so they can create a narrative that is more precise. I don't know, using this word for not thinking of a better one. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adawida. I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got 8 minutes left, and I should give really Paulo the last word. Clara, if you have a very quick point, would you mind? Because there's a couple of questions from the audience that we need to get in. Are you sure? Okay, no problem. Thank you, Clara. So just a couple of questions have come in, or one comment and one question from the audience, which just maybe we should deal with. Firstly, from Cecilia, it says, Paul, the formulation of your question leads me to wonder whether perhaps challenging the very preconception of the white cube as the dominant form of display might not be an interesting starting point for reflection too. And it's a well taken point. You know, why do we assume that the white cube is the dominant form? And perhaps we should challenge that. So well taken point there, Cecilia. And then from Chiro, there's a question. Good evening, everyone. My question is directed to Paulo. So this is a great handover to Paulo to close us this evening. My question does to Paulo. The Brazilian 1922's Modern Art Week is completing 100 years in 2022. So the legacy of Brazilian modernism and anthropophagic culture is being widely discussed. Since you've mentioned the ambiguity of the roles played by Oswaldo Andrade and Tarsila do Amaral in the occupation of spaces in Brazilian culture, how do you think we can discuss these modernist legacies without falling into anachronism or continuing to celebrate their appropriations of native Brazilian and Afro-diasporic cultures? And that's a great question that I had also thought about. So thank you for that. Paulo, over to you.
Well, I think in the first place, it depends on doing what we are doing here and in many other situations, which is not being afraid to name what's in place, because it would also be anachronist to just invalidate the whole thing and say, oh, let's not even talk about it because, you know, there were these appropriation which are at least problematic or incomplete or partial and so on. There is, but we have to be very clear in the way we address this, not as a footnote, but as one of the key topics in terms of scholar knowledge, curatorial work, museum organization, and so on. And of course, this will immediate this acknowledgement, a little bit like acknowledging an ownership, an original ownership of the land, leads directly to commitments of producing change, representativity, change in power distribution, change in the place of speech, and so on. And then I'm sure in Brazilian context as elsewhere, there are plenty of groups, collectives, and individuals with very deep roots and histories, which are more than willing and able to engage in these commitments of producing change and take this acknowledgement of a former violence as a context in which a work on history, memory, present, and future can and will be done. And then, on the other hand, or together with that, I would say, again, with with Glissant that what is I think there is the idea of appropriation is a little bit too flat, because it also, as Cecilia pointed out, it also reiterates an idea that there is a dominant force, a dominant field, which is complete and autonomous and pure, and it just appropriates everything and just grows. When we look closer, things are always more complicated than that. And Glissant devoted his life to point out to this complexity, because of course there are power relations which have to be addressed, but as someone tries to appropriate something, someone also changes what they are and what they are doing, and reveals more about how unpure or layered or fragmented that supposedly neutral or universal or pure knowledge or culture or device is and were. So I think it's also, when we discuss the legacy of anthropophagy and modernism, it's also an opportunity to reflect on this non-purity of the supposedly dominant and autonomous body of knowledge and culture. And then to address Eloisa's question about Jger. Jger was one of the first artists we invited after talking to many people over some months. I'm sure that from his point of view, who was always very urgent and very clear in his demands and necessities, and that idea of this is necessary for him and for many others, and when and where and how, he thought we took too long, like between conversations before we started really inviting artists. We did take some time, because each conversation changed the panorama of what we could be talking about. But when we finally started inviting artists, he was one of the first ones. And because of that, and because of his level of agency, many aspects of this biennial was transformed by his propositions and his critiques and his provocations, which of course include the show that he curated very clearly, but also things that are more subtle and more ungraspable. And then when finally, this is something Elisa was aware and it's worth sharing. So when the biennial was finally on and open in early September this year, Jger did this performance, and how do we say it, which was not previously scheduled, was not agreed with anyone. It was a spontaneous performance, so to say, in which he would walk with some of his colleagues and fellow indigenous artists around the biennial and through it, and in the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo, singing and performing and holding this paper that said the Bienal of the Indigenous People. Or it was even more provocative, because he would say a Bienal dos Índios, which today, as many other racial language, is understood as politically incorrect, because everyone supposed to say indigenous people or indigenous person and not Indio, which is very charged and also incorrect, because Indio would be someone from India. And but then he, as in many cases of identity discussions, positively adopted the Indio again, had reclaimed this term and said the Biennial of the Indios. And for those who follow the São Paulo biennial history, many editions of the biennial have a kind of official title and a nickname that society gives, the biennial of this, the biennial of that, and so on. And so he was claiming that this biennial should be called the biennial of the Indies, which for us was unexpectedly expected, in the sense that we always knew that Jger, Dayara, and so on were not settling like, oh, it's so good that this happened, we are so happy. No, it was always about this happened, what's next for us and for a broader movement. But then the way they did it was, for us, very welcome, because this is the kind of thing that a curator can never claim. An institution, nevertheless, I mean, if a big institution, a global institution like the Biennial is, comes and says, you know, this is the Biennial of the indigenous people, everyone would say, come on, what now are you claiming you are? No, it's completely out of place. It's not, even if all the curators of the Biennial were indigenous, I mean, it's 70 years of history, you cannot just do that. But then, since it was Jger that was with his fellow artists and colleagues reclaiming that, it was not about something that we are doing because we want to look nice, it was because they are appropriating, and then appropriating again in a different sense, they are appropriating that platform and saying, now that we came, we are unforgettable, we are really taking the scene, and this becomes our landmark. And for us, this is more than, it's better than anything we could hope for. So it was a strong moment that we could not have planned, but we welcome it.
Thank you so much. Muito obrigado a todos. That's my poor attempt at speaking Portuguese. Thank you so much to Clara, to Eloisa, to Carolina, and of course to Pamela. And of course, thanks to Michael and Sophia for organizing, and Lynn for support. Michael, do you want to close out?
Eu queria agradecer a todos.
Sure, I just wanted to thank you all. This has been a great debate, and it's been a pleasure. I loved all of our panelists and their interventions. We could be here for many other hours, I think, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. So thank you all very much. We'll see you later with the political bodies discussion at 5:30 London time. And next week, we'll meet again for 2 more sessions at 2:30 and 5:30 p.m. London time, if I'm not mistaken. Please make sure you check our website. We'll keep on posting new videos and the recordings of these sessions. Thank you. Thank you, Paul Goodwin. This was amazing. This was a great discussion. Paulo Miada, thank you very much. Thank you to the team of translators, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Quem que fala português, ô Michael?
Ah, eu sou brasileiro.
Tem brasileiro? Não. Tem? Really?
Yep.
You have the